The door is bolted from the outside. Beyond it, footsteps pace at intervals he no longer bothers to count. There is no crown in this room, no attendants waiting for his word, no silk, no incense, no music, only stone and cold, and the terrible quiet of a man who once believed he ruled by the will of God. He was anointed with holy oil before he could grow a beard. He was told from childhood that his person was sacred, that to raise a hand against him was to raise a hand against heaven itself. Now he sits behind a locked door, guarded like a common thief, waiting for men who were once his subjects to decide what becomes of him. He does not know, not yet, whether he will leave this room alive. Somewhere beyond these walls, a cousin he once called friend is deciding the fate of England. How does an anointed king fall this far? Who let it happen? And who, in the end, betrayed him first? To understand how Richard arrived at that locked door, we have to go back to a boy of 10, suddenly king, standing in a kingdom that had just lost its way. In 1377, when Edward III died, England did not simply gain a monarch, it inherited a vacuum. Richard's father, the celebrated Black Prince, had died the year before, leaving his young son to inherit a throne surrounded by ambitious uncles, a costly war with France, and a restless, taxed population. Richard was crowned amid pageantry designed to convince a nervous realm that its child king was chosen by God. But pageantry does not govern. Regency councils and powerful magnates did that instead, and the boy who would one day insist he alone held the right to rule spent his earliest years watching other men wield the power he believed was his by birth. That tension surfaced with startling force in 1381, when the Peasants Revolt swept through southern England. Furious over taxation and forced labor obligations, thousands marched on London, and for a moment, the entire kingdom seemed to teeter. What happened next revealed the young king's remarkable nerve. At only 14, Richard rode out to meet the rebels at Smithfield, where his own mayor struck down their leader, Wat Tyler, in a moment of chaos that could easily have ended in bloodshed on both sides. Richard, alone before an armed and furious crowd, called out that he himself would be their leader now. The revolt dispersed. It was a moment of extraordinary courage, and Richard seems never to have forgotten it. What he took from that day was not caution but confidence, a growing conviction that he was destined to rule without restraint and that his subjects would ultimately bend to his will if he simply asserted it. That belief did not sit well with England's most powerful lords. As Richard matured, he surrounded himself with favorites, men like Robert de Vere, elevated far beyond their birth, whose closeness to the king unsettled the old nobility. Suspicious of Richard's judgment and resentful of his favorite's influence, a group of powerful magnates known as the Lords Appellants moved against the crown itself in 1387 and 1388. They had de Vere driven into exile, executed several of Richard's closest allies, and forced the young king to watch as his authority was stripped away piece by piece. What Richard did not yet realize was how deeply this humiliation would settle into him, or how patiently he would wait to answer it. For a decade, Richard appeared to accept the new order, ruling carefully, rebuilding alliances, even securing peace with France through a long truce and a second marriage to the child Princess Isabella. But beneath that calm, according to chroniclers like the Monk of Westminster and Adam of Usk, Richard had not forgiven anyone. In 1397, the blow fell. Richard had 3 of the former Lords Appellant arrested, tried, and either executed or condemned. It was, by every account, an act of long-deferred royal vengeance, carried out with theatrical precision to remind the realm exactly who held ultimate power. But that single decision would change everything, because among the men whose position had grown suddenly precarious was Henry Bolingbroke, son of Richard's uncle John of Gaunt, and a man with royal blood of his own. In 1398, a quarrel between Bolingbroke and another nobleman, Thomas Mowbray, gave Richard an opening. Rather than let the dispute settle by trial of combat, he banished both men from England, Bolingbroke for 10 years. It seemed at the time a clever solution. What Richard could not have predicted was that his own decisions would soon hand Bolingbroke every reason to return with an army instead of an apology. When John of Gaunt died in early 1399, Richard extended Bolingbroke's exile to life and seized his vast inheritance for the crown. It was meant to cripple a rival. Instead, it convinced the greatest lords of England that no one's lands, no one's title, no one's future was safe from the king's will. If you're fascinated by forgotten moments like this, where one decision quietly seals a fate, consider subscribing because history is often stranger than fiction. Confident that no one would dare challenge him, Richard sailed to Ireland that summer to campaign against rebellion there, leaving England lightly defended. Behind palace walls, another crisis was already beginning. Bolingbroke landed in Yorkshire within weeks, declaring he had come only to reclaim his stolen inheritance. But noble after noble, weary of Richard's arbitrary rule and crushing taxation, flocked to Bolingbroke's banner instead. By the time Richard returned from Ireland, delayed and uncertain, his kingdom had already slipped from his hands. No one could have predicted how quickly his allies would vanish. Isolated at Conwy Castle in Wales, surrounded by a shrinking circle of loyal men, Richard was persuaded to meet Bolingbroke at Flint Castle under promise of safe negotiation. It was there, historians largely agree, that the king effectively became a prisoner in fact, whatever face was still being saved in public. If you're enjoying this journey into a king's unraveling, leaving a like helps more people discover stories like these. From Flint, Richard was brought to London, not as a monarch returning home, but as a captive paraded through the streets, while the crowds who once cheered him watched in silence or open hostility. In the Tower of London, according to the account known as the Record and Process, Richard was pressed to renounce his crown, and on the 29th of September 1400, he formally abdicated. Days later, Parliament deposed him regardless, citing his misrule, and Henry Bolingbroke was crowned Henry IV. The worst was still to come. Richard was moved in secrecy, first to Leeds Castle, then finally to Pontefract Castle in Yorkshire, far from London, far from any hope of rescue, held under guard in conditions the chroniclers describe only in fragments. By February 1400, Richard was dead. The official account claimed he starved himself in despair. Other chroniclers, including Adam of Usk and later French sources, suggested something far less voluntary, that he was deliberately denied food or killed outright on Henry's orders once a failed uprising by Richard's remaining loyalists made his continued existence too dangerous to permit. The truth was buried with him, and historians still debate it. What is certain is that his body was displayed publicly in London, proof to the realm that the once anointed king would never return. Let me know in the comments whether you think Richard sealed his own fate through his own choices, or whether history simply overtook a ruler who never learned to share his power. In the space of little more than little over 2 years, a king who believed his throne was untouchable by human hands became a nameless prisoner, then a rumor, then a body laid out for the crowd to confirm his death. The boy who once rode fearlessly into a rebel army had by the end no army left to ride to his aid. Perhaps that is the deepest tragedy of Richard II, not simply that he fell, but that his fall was built, decision by decision, entirely by his own hand. And somewhere in that locked room at Pontefract, in the last silent days before the end, he must have wondered, as the footsteps paced outside his door, exactly which choice it was that had cost him everything, and whether even now there had ever been a moment he could have turned back.